Hello there, friends. It's Jen Plotnikoff, and today we're going to talk a little bit about tarot. This is a series of many different videos that are meant to be accessible to many different levels of people who are interested in either developing their intuition or developing their skills with intuitive abilities. And the whole point of this whole thing is self-exploration and developing a sense of self-autonomy and really starting to hone our relationship for self-mastery, for a sense of self-propulsion in the world, and really so that we are making decisions and choices for ourselves from an integrated place. And, you know, there's a lot of noise out there in the world, and tarot, oracle cards, different kinds of intuitive tools can be really helpful for us to deepen our relationship with ourselves. Like, I'm not even talking about like our intuitive selves, but like with ourselves, like who am I? And to really kind of understand myself on the deepest level, and in many different ways. It's also a way to, because we are our own worst enemy in a lot of ways, right? We tend to self-judge in a pretty negative way, and we also self-judge in a pretty habitual way. We have a tendency to see ourselves in the same way as we've always seen ourselves, right? And so these kinds of tools are different ways to be able to see ourselves from a different lens, from a different perspective. And that can really free us to open our minds, open our hearts, and open our way of being, to be able to make choices, to make choices that are best for us in the moment. Maybe it's can provide some guidance for us when we're in challenging moments, and also it can just be a really fun way to just deepen our own relationship with ourselves. So anyway, without further ado, again, this series is for beginner and expert. I'm going to talk today a little bit about tarot cards versus oracle cards because I have them here. Why not? So, a couple different things. Tarot. Tarot is a very particular, I've got my cards here. I've got a couple different decks. This is the deck that I tend to use all the time for readings for myself and others. The tarot has a particular history of its development. I'm not going to go into the whole thing. You can Google that. But essentially, it is based on several layers of symbology, religion, different kinds of Kabbalistic religions, for example. There are different versions of the tarot. It has kind of evolved in Europe over many different kinds of generations and iterations. And it has been used as a tool for, projecting the future, I guess, and making decisions. And it's also been just like a game as well, right? It is deeply imbued with a lot of different kinds of symbolisms that tend to follow a particular storyline. So most tarot, like in terms of its origins, kind of come from a few different places. We have the very famous Rider-Waite-Coleman-Smith deck, which is kind of what most people refer to when it comes to tarot. And a lot of the symbology, mythology, kind of core pieces around what's on each card and the story of tarot tends to come from that particular lineage. And there are millions of decks out there. I mean, there are ridiculous amounts of decks. This is, of course, one of, many, many, many thousands, probably tens of hundreds of thousands. I don't know. There's a lot. Some decks are connected to and follow that traditional lineage of the Rider-Waite-Coleman-Smith symbology, and some of them don't. and everything in between. So that is a little bit about kind of tarot. And the thing that for me that I find really helpful in understanding that is because of that foundations, there is a particular structure to the way that the deck is laid out. And there are particular traditional meanings for cards. Of course, there are many layers as we go deeper, as we know and we study more. There are many more deeper layers to each card as you learn. You don't have to learn it all at once. If you are just new at this and you just bought a tarot deck, don't freak out. Like, you're not going to learn it all in 1 year. Like, there are scholars who have spent years and decades and are still learning more things. So it's okay. Start where you are and that be that. Oracle cards. So tarot, just to recap, has a particular structure and meaning. Of course, there are a lot of kinds of decks that stray from that meaning or have different interpretations of their own take on the traditional tarot. But there is a particular trajectory and storyline to that. Okay, so pros of this. Pros of this are twofold. One is that if you are someone that has a hard time kind of connecting to your intuition in general, if you identify as like, this whole like woo-woo thing, all that kind of stuff. And by the way, what I'm talking about is every one of these decks comes with its own little interpretive guidebook, right? And so the tarot guidebooks will often speak to the traditional tarot narrative, unless you have a deck that is an alternative deck, in which case, hopefully they've provided you a guide deck with some of those alternative ideas of why they've chosen those particular, symbologies. But back to pros and cons. So the pro of working with the structure of tarot is that there's a structure, right? There's a structure, there's some traditions. And so if you have a hard time with interpretation, right? If you are like, okay, I have these different cards that I pulled. Now, what the hell does this mean? What do they mean together? The nice thing about the tarot is that it can give you a sense of a roadmap by following the different symbols and starting to understand, because you can of course like learn these things over time. You get more layers, but even as a really, really basic, I remember the very first tarot workshop I ever did, and I had been working in intuitive work for like a really long time, but I hadn't actually worked with tarot specifically. I had worked with pure intuitive work, like no cards, no tools, and I had also worked with oracle or like certain tools, but more intuitive type tools. More about that in a minute. And one of the things that I found really fascinating is, so I was in this workshop with a group of, we were doing different tables, right? And in my table, there's maybe 4 or 5 different people, and we were kind of doing a practice reading with each other after learning a little bit about a particular suit, right? So we were studying a particular suit. Some of the meanings, we went through the meanings of that whole suit. And then we did a reading with each other based around that suit. And the thing that was interesting is even people that had had no experience in doing any kind of reading or intuitive stuff were able to go from their notes that they had taken down and actually just, talk about the particular points. And each time they were bang on, right? So often what happens is we're like doubtful because we're just learning this thing and we're practicing the thing and we're like, this doesn't make any sense to me, right? Because when you're reading for a different person, it usually doesn't make sense to you unless you become more experienced, in which case you become more confident. But usually when you're reading about somebody else's life, like you're you don't have personal involvement, you're a bystander. So it might not make a lot of sense to you. This is where, though, for when we start to read for ourselves, things can get a little tricky because we don't have that sense of neutrality, right? We're not unbiased. When we read for other people that we don't know, we're unbiased, right? We don't know them. But when we read for ourselves, we have a lot of bias. And so for me, one of the pros of tarot has been, one, if you are new at the whole intuitive thing and that intuitive development stuff kind of overwhelms you, having like a foundation and a roadmap might be a really, really, really helpful place to start. And even if you are really, really intuitive, I highly recommend working with tarot to read for yourself specifically and work with yourself specifically. Because when we are, especially if there's emotional charge, especially when, and that's often when we come to these tools is like, I'm stressed out, like, do I leave my job? Do I leave my relationship? Like, making some big decision. Is this right for me or not? We like self-block, right? We kind of mess ourselves over and confuse ourselves in a situation. If somebody else was looking in, they would have a lot more clarity, right? And so this is where we can actually use something structured like tarot to help us kind of cut through our own BS and really get to what's actually important. So it can give us, so two big pros of tarot are that it can give us a roadmap when we are just starting to develop our intuition. And the other pro is it can really cut through a lot of our own BS when we're reading for ourselves. So two pros, right? Oracle cards, on the other hand. So let's talk about a little bit about what they are and what the pros and cons of Oracle cards are. So Oracle cards, I've got just one example. I've got several decks. My very first deck was an Oracle deck. I still work with it. I love that deck. And I kind of work with them on and off. Sometimes I will mix them up. Sometimes, anyway, more about that later. Oracle decks. Oracle decks do not necessarily have a particular form. They have sometimes numbers on them. Here's an example. Of course, it's backwards. Roots of abundance. They have numbers on them sometimes. They have words on them. They have pretty pictures. Sometimes they have all of the above and none of the above. They could be about astrology. They could be about symbolism. They could be about myths. They could be about storytelling. They could be about flowers. They could be about all of these different, this one's upside down. They could be about a lot of different things. And because of that, if you are someone who is wanting a more intuitive based approach, working with Oracle cards might be helpful. Because although they usually come with, like this is the deck, this is a Baron Reed deck, just as an example, right? No, no affiliations with any of these people or products. So they usually come with a guidebook because the creator of the Oracle deck often has an intention or idea about why they created that deck. So they might talk about the themes, they might talk about the particular symbolism that they chose in the artwork, in the words, in the numbers, right? And they're all different. They usually have less cards. So tarot tends to be a standard 78 cards, right? There are, how many we've got? So we've got them in tarot, I'm talking about tarot right now. We've got a very, we've got a format, right? We have, 0 to 21. So we have 22 cards in the major arcana. And then we have the minor arcana, which consists of 4 suits. Just like in a deck of cards, right? You have like the aces we have the spades and the hearts and the diamonds and the clubs in much like, because again, tarot came from playing cards. There's a lot of reflection in that, right? So this is why you can actually just use playing cards, because playing cards don't have the major arcana, but you're basically working with the minor arcana, right? The minor arcana are aces, ace 2, 3, 4, all the way up until 10. And then we have the page, the queen, and the king. In the traditional, of course, Rider-Waite, Coleman-Smith ideology, which are, parallel to the jacks, the queens, and the kings in a normal deck of cards, right? So we have a particular order and form. And so with the tarot, no matter what kind of themes or what kind of whatever, they might have different names, they might have changed different kinds of, imagery and played with all that, but they tend to all have 22 cards that are major arcana. What does that give you for 56 cards for minor arcana? And, they go from 1 till king or whatever they decide to call it. Whereas Oracle cards You can have decks that have 44. You can have decks that come with 50. So even, for example, like if you look at this particular deck versus my tarot deck, the tarot deck is thicker and bigger, right? Because it's got more cards in it. This deck actually has a thicker card stock, so thicker paper, but it has less cards overall. So it's just overall smaller. And this is a lovely Oracle deck. But pros to Oracle decks. Pros are, if you want to kind of go away from any kind of like format distractions, if you're really actually wanting to work with your own intuitive stuff and you don't want any kind of like symbology or anything like that kind of getting in the way of your own interpretations, if you want to practice that, Oracle decks can be really helpful for that, right? Because basically you can just look at whatever you see in the image, see what draws to you, and so you can work with that, whether it's colors, whether it's images. It can be great for really developing your sense of intuition. Also, sometimes, also when you're starting out, Oracle cards tend to have a more gentle, let's say, energy. And what I mean by that is they tend to be exclusively pretty positive. Not all Oracle decks, but as a whole, they tend to be more love and light in terms of positive vibes only kind of energy. It's really, I have yet to find an Oracle deck that has like the death card, for example, in it, which is like in tarot, tarot is in comparison is like all of life, right? So it's got the good stuff, it's got the bad stuff, it's got the gray zone, it's got everything in between. It's not going to sugarcoat it, if you know what I mean. Whereas the Oracle cards can tend to be more on the soft and sweet kind of end on things. So if you're someone who's just tiptoeing and maybe you have a lot of fear or trepidation around that, this might be a good place to start, right? So picking an Oracle deck might be a good place to start for you. That said, if you aren't really connected to that intuitive thing, what happens is that you become pretty bound to the book that it comes with. And this is where I see the cons, right, of Oracle cards. The con is that you are bound to the interpretation that the person that created the deck has created it, right? So if you're using it, if you're using it in terms of a learning kind of way, this can be a place where, like, often where people start is they start with an Oracle deck and then they read the book, and then they're kind of in a place where, like, I would like to be able to actually understand and interpret it for myself, but they kind of feel trapped in always listening to the book. And it's totally fine, by the way. Like, I mean, there are amazing readers. I have a friend of mine who did a reading for me, and she's an amazing intuitive person. And she will she'll do her intuitive interpretation, and then sometimes she'll like pull out the book as an added information, right? It might be helpful. There might be helpful stuff in there. There's a reason why there's a book. However, the book is not the be all and end all of that particular interpretation. So sometimes we can actually lose a lot of like nuance and depth to a reading. Because the thing is that, so here is where pros and cons happen. This is where I find like Oracle cards tend to be more two-dimensional and flat when it comes to the nuance of certain situations, right? Which is kind of how I use them. So often when I'll do a reading for myself, I did one actually recently for the equinox, okay? I might use a Oracle card for like looking at an overall theme, and then I might do clarification with my tarot cards because they're going to be able to give me more detail. Oracle cards tend to have like a kind of a more big picture, themey kind of stuff. Or they can be really helpful, you know, if you're having a shitty day and you need a little bit of love. Sometimes they can be really like uplifting, right? So they can kind of provide that sense of positivity and support, which there's nothing wrong with that. I find tarot a lot more helpful for things like clarity and decision making, and having more, there's more of a structure, more of a pointedness, more of a cut through our own BS kind of thing. So they tend to give us more information about the situation, about the question that we are asking, right? So that's a little bit of a summary. I went a little longer than I hoped to, but that is a summary to kind of give you an idea of what these particular things are, how I might use them, and maybe what you might enjoy more, or one over the other, both, and how they might help you where you are in this moment in time. So hope you enjoyed this little episode. More to come very soon. And for now, ciao, ciao.